Welcome to another episode of Patterns and Stories. Joining us today is Yohan Iddawela, a data scientist at the Asian Development Bank. Yohan studies the use of satellite data as a tool for estimating economic development in areas where reliable economic data may be scarce. We are your hosts, Luca Delana and Ismail Manik.
Good morning, Yohan. Thank you for joining our podcast. You have a very unique background in the sense that your research area is focused on kind of a niche element in the development community.
Thank you. And first of all, thanks a lot for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to speak to you both. By way of background, my research focuses on the intersection of economics and geospatial data science. And this all came about after some research I initially did around 10 years ago for the World Bank. We went to Uganda and we were trying to understand why the manufacturing industry in Kampala was kind of stagnating. We had a number of different theories around why that was the case. We thought it could be related to the high cost of imports, the exchange rate depreciating, the high cost of borrowing, so interest rates were really high, electricity wasn't very stable, and so on. We went in and surveyed about 150 different firms of all sizes to work out what was actually the problem. And something really interesting came back, which we didn't expect. A lot of these people we interviewed said one of the main problems was around the quality of local governments. So they weren't incredibly efficient. There were people who may not have been completely motivated, various types of issues that these entrepreneurs essentially discussed. So I thought that was a really interesting and unexpected response, and I thought it warranted further research. Eventually did a PhD looking at local institutions in Africa. But one of the problems that you've got is there's not a lot of data available at the subnational level, and that's kind of a problem across the world. So one thing that we try and do in research is use geospatial data, so satellite images, to try and get a picture of what's happening at really local levels where official data wasn't available. So that's the whole background into merging the whole economic space with geospatial data science for my research.
Can you expand a little bit on just like a 101 on the demystify a little bit the area for our audience?
So remote sensing encompasses a lot of different types of data. You might have daytime satellite imagery, you might have nighttime satellite imagery, you might have radar, and so on. What's probably most interesting for development practitioners, public policy practitioners, is how can we use this type of alternative satellite-based data to proxy for economic activity, particularly when official statistics are not present or are not of high quality. So one thing that's been done now for about 13 years in academia is using nighttime satellite images as a proxy for economic activity. Essentially what this captures is the brightness of a place at night. The idea is that places with more economic activity are brighter because there's more luminosity, there's more illumination from buildings. And this can capture consumption-related activities when you go out to restaurants, cafes, and so on at night, or when you produce things like factories that operate at night. So what you can do, interestingly, with satellite imagery is drill down to really granular levels. The satellite images are available at areas of 500 meters by 500 meters. So that's very granular. And it's also high frequency. So you can get this data daily, weekly, monthly, annually, and so on. It's a really interesting data set, which we can use when this official data simply doesn't exist. This is now one of the most commonly used proxies for economic activity in the development public policy space where official data doesn't exist. So I would say that's kind of the basics or the one-on-one of the most important data set in this space.
Can you then tell us what happens after you elaborate this data, depending on what happens when you discover that certain areas are more or less bright and so on? What's the next step?
It's a question for policymakers. But one thing that really got me interested in this space was during the pandemic, where, especially in the UK where I was living at the time, there were a lot of localized lockdowns. And it was very difficult to quantify the impact of these localized lockdowns on local economies. You could do it at the national level. Because nighttime luminosity data is really granular and frequent, we were able to identify changes in where economic activity was taking place. So central London was becoming a lot less bright because people were working from home, and areas on the periphery of London, like Essex, for example, were actually getting brighter as more people were spending time at home and consuming more locally. So then it's a question of what the government wants to do with that data and that information. But the first step is analyzing and assessing the impact of a policy, and then you can sort of tweak it. Maybe the government wanted to regenerate economic activity in the London CBD, which I think they tried to do with various policies. I think there was a program for giving people vouchers to eat out to regenerate the economy of restaurants and bars and whatnot. So I would say the answer to that question really is related to what the policy goals are of governments.
What do you think when you look at the economics profession and also the development economics? Is this still kind of an underrated area of application in the economics? Are we using these geospatial technologies in the mainstream of economics and in identifying development projects?
If you look at the top economics journals, so that's like American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and so on, there is not a lot of publications that use remote sensing data. So maybe that suggests that these tools are underrated or underutilized. It could also suggest that economists are just interested in different questions. Outside of those top tier publications, especially in the development economic space, there's a big focus on nightlights because these studies focus on areas where official statistics just do not exist at a subnational level. If you're looking at countries in Europe or North America, you do have decent subnational GDP estimates, but they don't exist in many parts of the world, in Asia, Africa, South America, and so on. So you'll find that publications that are interested in more of these types of locations and geographies are using these remote sensing data more, but it's still, I wouldn't say mainstream. And it's part of our responsibility for people like myself to try and demystify it, encourage the use of it, and with more tools continually being developed, I think the barriers to using these tools for economic analysis are slowly eroding.
One area of application, I guess, is related to climate. And I was reading I think just a few days back, Italy's article for report came out, and one of the selected issues had a theme discussing climate issues. Let me quote from, it mentions that between 1980 and 2023, Italy suffered, in terms of economic losses from climate-related disasters, 134 billion euros. Yet it mentions only 4% of these losses were insured. I guess partly there is also the data issues. And how do you see, with regard to climate and climate-related challenges that we could see in the future, this kind of approach be helpful, better than the standard?
Yeah, using these sorts of geospatial climate data sets is much more common in the environmental space and the environmental economic space rather than the, let's say, macro or micro space. And it's very important for assessing future risks or probability of risks to people and infrastructure. I'm also seeing a lot of projections, the geospatial climate projections going out to 2100. There's an initiative called CMIP that tries to do this. And what you can then do is look at projections and look at where your infrastructure exists, and to demonstrate and work out the extent to which your infrastructure is going to be jeopardized by these climate risks. That information can then be used to reinforce infrastructure, to mitigate and to adapt to it. So I know the World Bank and ADB is doing a lot of work using these data sets and then trying to plan responses to these climate projections.
I guess another area is the rapid development of what's happening in the AI space. And do you see any, in terms of AI applications over the top of the geospatial data and its use in with regard to weather forecasting or extreme climate events? What is the realistic going forward in the next few years versus the hype that is happening kind of in this area?
AI is really a buzzword at the moment, I guess, since the release of ChatGPT. Everyone is talking about it. But the reality is AI, or as we call it, deep learning or machine learning, has been a core part of geospatial data science, environmental science for 10, 15 years at least. So it's always been there. It's just now, I guess, much more popular and public facing AI applications. So while it's always been there, I think we'll see AI being used in different ways. So one way is through what's known as foundation models. Foundation models are the geospatial space's answer to these large language models like ChatGPT or Claude that you might have used. And essentially the way it works is it takes all publicly available satellite images, feeds it into a really massive deep learning model. And the model can then learn similarities between, let's say, a tree in South America and a tree in Southeast Asia. And it learns these sort of interconnections, and that forms what's known as embeddings. So what that essentially means is once you have these pre-trained models, if you want to study something like flooding in the Philippines, you need to feed it less examples of what a flood looks like in the Philippines than you would have otherwise, because it can pull on its knowledge of what floods looks like in other contexts. And then you can use that to estimate what the flood extent in the Philippines would be. So this is a really interesting use case of these foundation models, but there have been a lot of studies looking at whether this is slightly overhyped and whether this is an old concept with a new name. The old concept is training a model in somewhere like, let's say, Colombia on flooding, and then adapting that to measure flooding in the Philippines. So that is called a pre-trained model and transfer learning. And a foundation model is kind of a new version of that. What people are finding, though, is that sometimes these foundation models, even though they're a big, new, sexy topic at the moment, they still don't perform as well as just your traditional deep learning models that are trained on floods for the Philippines. So in a way, there's this a little bit of overhype. However, I don't want to discount the rate of progress in AI. So while that might be the status quo right now, maybe in a couple of years' time, that'll completely change. There's a lot of bright minds in this space and really impressive companies and organizations that are working on this problem. So I'm sure that'll change over time.
I've read with interest your 2021 paper on the on the quality of the subnational governments in Africa. And I know that it's focused on the nighttime approach, that approach that you just mentioned. But I was just wondering if while you studied the importance of subnational governments on the development and the economy of regions, if you had any thoughts about how can a country or a region improve the quality of their subnational government?
There was a really interesting NGO I came across in Uganda, and we did a bit of work together. It's called SEMA, SEMA, and they were trying to improve the quality of local governments in Uganda. At least it started in Uganda. I think they've now expanded to other countries in East Africa. And what they would do is they would go to local government offices. So local government offices could be places where you pick up your driving license. It could be a local police office. It could be a local health clinic. And they would send enumerators to wait outside the office, and they would survey people on the way out and get their thoughts on the quality of the service. And they would then aggregate all of these survey responses, and they would kind of create a leaderboard. So these local governments were compared to one another in terms of the quality of their services. And this is all using behavioral economics, essentially, to try and incentivize these local government officials to improve the quality of the services they were providing their citizens. So this is a really interesting approach. It certainly worked. But one of the problems, though, is that there are structural and systematic issues that this type of thing might not be able to address. So one example is a lot of these local government offices are completely underfunded. So no matter how many incentives you have, if there's just not enough resources available, they won't be able to deliver services. And then when you start talking about corruption, corruption can take place at various levels. It can take place when the person you're going to visit to pick up your driving license asks you for a bribe. Well, that's very easy for a numerator standing outside the building to quantify. There could be corruption at the higher levels, which cannot really be easily quantified. And so this approach cannot really target those more systematic occurrences of corruption, for example, but it is a start. And Also, collecting data is an excellent place to begin because what gets measured gets managed, as they say.
Yeah, that is an interesting study you mentioned, especially with regard to you combine with a leaderboard. And coming back to the NGO study you mentioned, what was the reaction of comparing was it a positive reaction in terms of did it create an incentive for some level of improvement among the local governments?
In order for these enumerators to be allowed to stand outside the building, they needed the buy-in of the head of that local government office. So local government officers that weren't sort of on board with this approach would just say no. So you might have kind of selection bias here where it's just the officers who wanted to improve were participating in this. And based on the responses from the surveys, so they went out and they spoke to the local government officials later. So not just the people that were going in to see the officers, but the officers themselves. And they were saying it was a really fun game. It was giving them more incentive, more purpose. They really enjoyed it. But again, there might be selection bias here in terms of which officers actually participated.
Did you also do some work on the, let's say, not on the offices that are providing services, but like on the more administrative side, for example, the parts of the local governments where they take decisions or where they allocate funding at the more local level?
Yeah, this organization had only focused on service delivery, so the touch point between the government and the citizens. So that space that you're talking about wasn't really studied, but it would be very interesting to see the results of the study looking at that.
Thank you.
One area which has been in the popular media, AI weather forecasting, may not directly relate to the work you're doing, but it has been in the news for this model does better or things like that has been in the news lately. How do you kind of build trust in these kind of models amongst the communities and the governments? Weather forecasting is one area which has a direct impact on the people and the communities. You have if you do a fishing business or even agriculture. What about this specific area?
Yeah, climate forecasting is quite interesting. There's a lot of big companies like Google, Microsoft that are working on this, and they're throwing these various AI approaches with satellite-based data, and it seems like they're able to perform on par or better than the more traditional ways of doing weather modeling. And it's a lot cheaper to do, so it can run on a smaller computer rather than kind of an enterprise system. But the question of trust is tough, and I would be interested in both of your take on that. But it all comes down, in my opinion, to incentives. Based on my experience working for governments, the incentive is to make sure that things don't go wrong. And if things do go wrong, you don't want to be blamed for it. So that means that there's a real bias to the status quo. If something has always worked, even if it's a bit more inefficient, if it hasn't gone wrong, there's no incentive to change it to something that is untested and might go wrong. So that really comes down to a more fundamental question of how do you incentivize risk in the public service? I don't have great answers for that. Every couple of years, every government, I'm sure around the world, does a review into how this can be improved, and nothing substantial seems to be able to happen. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to build trust on these types of platforms, even if they're done by really reputable organizations like Microsoft and Google.
Luca might have some thoughts on because of his area of research. And
yeah, like what I see in these cases is that it's really hard to create this change if there is no buy-in from let's say the level higher than the one at which you want to have change, because no matter how much you try to put some incentives, the higher incentives will always be like the one that Johan mentioned. No matter how much you use words to promote change. In most organizations, like my expertise is not with public ones, it's with private ones, but I suppose it's not that different in public ones. No matter which words you use to create change, people's doubt will always be, but is my direct supervisor on board? Or will I be blamed by him for following this initiative that he didn't buy in? And so for me, like,
the really big key bottleneck is this idea of like the supervisor at all levels needs to be the one driving change, because otherwise he will be a bottleneck. And yeah, the good thing is that you can create kind of chain reactions, because at the end everyone has a supervisor, and if you get the real buy-in at the top, you can move supervisor by supervisor on the way down. But if you don't have the buy-in at the top, it's extremely hard. So much that, for example, one of the things I sometimes advise in some situations is focus your effort in the areas where you know that supervisor buy-in is achievable or is already there. And maybe afterwards, when you created some wins over there, you can use those wins to convince the other ones, but very hard to have a cold start otherwise.
Yeah, given that there is also a kind of a political process involved, it's sometimes get complicated. So Johan, assuming that you have been appointed as finance minister in an African country, you're looking at the budget, how would you kind of when there is acute shortage in across the stream of, if you want to kind of put resources in this area, do you put it in the local government level or in the central, say, environment ministry, or in a line ministry, or in what how would you actually look into the budget and build resources? What would be the first area of kind of, is it the capacity building, you have to upfront the build capacity, or kind of how would be the priority if you want to actually strengthen this area within a government setting?
Sure. I think there's two things that come to mind. The first is working out what the constitution of that country looks like. So different countries have devolved different powers to local governments. So in some countries, power is really centralized with the national governments rather than the local governments. So if that's the case, then it makes sense to obviously target the central government first, but it all depends on the constitution. The second is the real starting point is doing a diagnostic of where money is being spent in the first instance. This is what the IMF, the World Bank do when they go into countries when they're preparing loans or assistance. But actually, one of the first things that we find in public financial management is sometimes it's not very transparent. And this has led to huge economic problems in many places. Puerto Rico, for example, is a really interesting case in Central America, where it was effectively bankrupt, and then it was hit by two huge hurricanes. And the money was being transferred from the central government to the provinces, but the provinces didn't have great accounting practices, so it was very difficult to follow where the money is being spent. Ideally, what you want when you go in and look at a budget is to look at a line item and then to be able to see where exactly that money was being spent. Whether it's spent on a hospital in one specific location, we want to be able to trace it. And if you can't trace it, well, then that's really the first thing that you need to do. And then the second thing you need to do is do an audit of how the money is being spent, where it's going. And then you can identify if these institutions are being underfunded, for example, and need more resources. So that's how I would think about structuring it.
Yeah, but the challenge is in terms of getting the baseline where things are in terms of data quality. And say every Article 4 has this, at the end they have an annex of data quality issues in the country. And just to give the example of Italy, which I had been looking over yesterday, data quality, it gets a report in all kind of in terms of the data issues with regard to national accounts and this. And it was interesting, actually. I put it the document into AI, and AI said there are serious issues in terms of data quality in Italy, but it was a kind of hallucination in that sense. And I asked for a reason. It said it apologized and said the reason it gave was semantic overreach, that the AI had committed, the GPT had committed semantic overreach, and it corrected. But I don't know, is it the case that these sometimes when institutions they look at it a very high level, then these kind of ratings or done might not actually give a good baseline. So there is my concern. How do we get a good baseline on some of these issues with regard to the quality of data, and especially with regard to this is not a standardized or common area of focus for, say, IMF comes and reviews. They don't look at what is the quality of geospatial data. It's not very important. They first look at the national accounts and the basic level of economic data. They don't. It's not a. It won't be a priority. Should this be a priority, or how should you kind of get a good baseline assessment, given that this should be very important priority than some of the economic statistics that are currently on top?
Yeah, you point to a interesting issue. When it comes to national accounts, you have frameworks like the UN's System of National Accounts, which was released in 2008. So that gives you kind of a framework or guidance on how national accounts should be put together. Once you have that framework, you can then look at, was it actually put together in the way that it was supposed to? And that's how you can identify if there's any issues with the quality of the data. The problem with geospatial data is there's no framework. And this is something that's a huge problem because we've spoken briefly about nightlights. There's actually many different ways of processing nightlights data. For example, sometimes the angle of the satellite is different from one day to another, which means that luminosity readings might be different from one day to another because of the angle of the satellite, not that there's more people out on the street. And this is kind of a huge problem. What we then need is more standards and more frameworks so that we can all kind of unify how we process this type of geospatial data so that we're comparing apples with apples here. So it's kind of a big problem in the geospatial space. It's something that I want to try and target a little bit more in my research.
In terms of the available open source versus what is available, can you give a little bit of breakdown on this aspect?
The open source data is fantastic. The European Space Agency, NASA, are doing a great job of putting satellites up into space and making the images from those satellites free. They come with various limitations. For example, they might not be as granular as you want. And if you want really granular information, maybe it's for defense purposes or investment purposes where you can like oil wells and these types of things, you might pay for data from a commercial supplier. But generally, I find that the free satellite data is enough for the main use cases that we have in public policy.
So if a young person wants to move into this field, what is the kind of what degree or what area of specialization do you think to move for someone who is interested in this area of research? Should it be from economics background or from, say, environmental or marine science or machine learning or statistics?
The main value out of geospatial data, or any data for that matter, is it's a means to an end. And the end is always some type of insight. So I think of it as a tool. And it doesn't matter if you're from economics or an environmental or an AI background. This can be a tool to help you get the insights that you're after, depending on what your day job is and the type of analysis that you're after. So it can be useful. The problem, of course, is how do you get used to it? How do you learn about this sort of information? I don't know any great resources that can take you from zero to hero from scratch. I did some courses at university. That was my exposure to it. There are some websites like aiddata.org, which is part of the William and Macy University, that actually provide you geospatial data in a spreadsheet. So they've done all of the complicated processing for you. You can just download it and start using it in your analysis. That's a wonderful way to just get some initial exposure to this type of data. That was my initial exposure before I had more in-depth programming experience. And then there's wonderful resources on YouTube as well. Xusheng Wu, who's an academic, I think at Tennessee in the US, has some great tutorials on YouTube on using Python for geospatial analysis. Organizations like DataCamp that provide really short interactive R and Python courses for geospatial analysis, and they do a range of other things as well. And finally, I really feel like large language models are reducing the barrier to working with this data, because now you can work with it using natural language. You can ask it what type of analysis should be done, give me the Python or R code for that type of analysis. It might require some sort of debugging, and I feel like it moves you from being someone that creates code to someone who edits code, but still that reduces the barriers, and hopefully that's another entry point for people wanting to explore this type of data.
Okay.
I just wanted to share, since a couple of questions ago you mentioned data quality issues in Italy. I just wanted to mention an anecdote that happened to me, but it can probably show also why it's important to have additional approaches such as the one that Yohan mentioned, with which you can cross-check data. So what happened is that I had to go to the post office, and I was a bit worried because that post office when I was a child was incredibly inefficient, and you would spend hours trying to do what you needed. And then I enter, and to the right, I see that there is written that that office recently won the region's efficiency award. So I'm very excited. Maybe things changed in the last decade. And I get my queue number, and it's 85. I check what number they're serving. They're serving 69. I'm like, oh, I will lose at least half an hour here. Then they start calling the numbers with this speed, 70, 71, 72. And then I start getting excited. I think maybe people took the queue number and then they went shopping or whatever. 75, 76. They continue. They get to my number. I rush to the counter, and then they keep calling the other numbers, 88, 89, 90. And then I tell them, I have number 85. And the lady tells me, we are still serving number 69. I'm just pushing the button so that in the headquarters, it doesn't look like we have a long queue. And yeah, that's just an idea of how you can have a lot of these distortions, and why I really like and welcome additional approaches like the one Yohan mentioned, like the one of the NGO that goes collecting ground data, observing behaviors, and surveying customers. Yeah. So thank you very much.
That's hilarious. You need enumerators standing outside that office so you can report them.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for when maybe one day there will be like also apps and whatever that will help citizens self-enumerate for that.
Yeah. Surely that's around the corner.
Yeah. Are you aware of any effort in this direction?
I'm not, but I recollect all of these little hardware devices at airports, for example, or where you can push green, yellow, or red, depending on your experience. Presumably that can also be gamed, right?
Yes.
You've just got the receptionist keeps hitting green, for example.
Yeah. I can see that happening, yes.
One thing we ask all our guests is, I think you have mentioned some of the areas, but are there any book recommendations that you give in this area that are must reads, or kind of, or even for the general public to get familiarized with the field? Are there any that kind of books as well? Do you have any?
To be honest, I haven't got any recommendations for great geospatial books. My book recommendations for people interested in economic development or international development would be Joe Studwell's books. How Asia Works is fantastic. Also his earlier book, which is called Asian Godfathers. It's particularly interesting if you've got to focus on Southeast Asia. And that talks about, really, I think a trend of both of those books actually is to compare why East Asia managed to develop a lot more than Southeast Asia, and what East Asia did, but also some systematic issues in Southeast Asia that he discusses, like state capture, rent seeking, these types of things. It's a really fascinating read. What I would love, actually, is in the development space, there's been a lot of focus on East Asia and the Asian tigers. But I think a real development success story are the Balkans. If you look at the growth rates of GDP per capita for Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, they're incredible following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I would love someone to put together a book explaining the development policies that have been developed for those countries.
I think on
Thank you.
Poland, there has been some publications on the Polish economic growth, but I don't know about other.
From memory, I think Poland's GDP per capita is now less than Lithuania's. So Poland is very interesting. They've done incredibly well, but it'd be great to benchmark that to the Balkans.
Thank
Luca?
you. And another question we ask all guests is, what is one question that you never get asked in podcasts or conferences, but you would love to get asked?
That one? No. A question around sustainability of geospatial platforms, I think would be really interesting. So what I find a lot of is there's an ecosystem of companies who get grants from NASA, the European Space Agency and whatnot, who do these one-off consulting projects using remote sensing data. So that might be doing a flood analysis, climate analysis, infrastructure, and so on. But these are never really productized. What would be amazing is if these companies could find a way to take these consulting experiences, which continue to happen, as essentially ways to create proofs of concepts or prototypes for an actual product. And then if they could create something like a SaaS product where you pay $10, $15 a month, and you can access these platforms that are developed not just by data scientists for other data scientists, but they're developed using normal startup practices, with good UI, UX, focusing on the end user, making it really intuitive to use rather than having to wade through like a 1 hour long tutorial or presentation on using a convoluted platform. I think that would be really helpful for organizations like the World Bank, ADB, for governments, but also in just reducing these barriers for people to interact with geospatial data. So I would love to see this shift towards more sustainability in this space from a lot of the companies that are operating there.
What you mentioned just reminded me that there was this recent discussion or podcast I listened to, and this was with Balaji, who is based currently. He's an American Indian tech person now based in Singapore. He started this what is called network schools, and he has this concept of network state. And he was interviewing Jeremy Howard, who is an Australian who does a lot of these. He has this fast AI courses where he tries to he's like the Han Academy of with regard to AI, you could say something like that. So he tries to teach and make it accessible for people in especially developing countries to study AI field. And I guess this is an area where maybe those type of accessibility could also be increased through kind of work that the multilaterals could work with people like that, I guess. What do you think should be some of the areas that multilaterals could focus on? Why I'm saying that, because multilaterals are also in various stages. So you have the Islamic Development Bank or Inter-American Development Bank. So I feel that they try to kind of benchmark themselves among themselves. In a way, World Bank is kind of a leader in other multilateral banks to some extent try to follow. So what is the advice you would or suggest to the approaches currently we have to scale up this important area?
There's two things that not just multilateral development banks, but international organizations, the UN, like UNDP, for example, are working on. That's number one, building data centers. So they want to provide funding so that countries can localize their data, which makes sense. These can be really expensive infrastructure to build up. And the second is around digital transformation. So how can governments understand how AI can improve productivity and efficiency and implement those in government settings? So I think doubling down on those would be helpful, but I would also caution anyone getting too involved in the AI hype, in the sense that because a lot of governments might be seeing OpenAI, Google, Anthropic training their own models, they might feel like they need to train their own model as well. It's just so expensive for the compute, for the energy consumption, for the resources, for the technical skills to build a model from scratch. I don't think it makes sense for countries to do that, unless they're operating in languages which are not captured at all by these large language models. And ChatGPT, for example, works across many languages. I've used it in Vietnamese, Indonesian, and so on, Thai, and it works great. But there might be some languages, like in Australia, for example, some of the indigenous languages are probably not captured by these LLMs. So maybe it makes sense to build models or fine-tune existing models. But generally, I don't think it makes sense for countries to go down the path of building their own models from scratch. So I would caution multilaterals or international organizations from recommending that. unless there are good reasons to do that. And that said, I haven't seen them do this, but I would just caution against them doing it if they are thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yohan, for taking the time for coming here. We really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.